A ruthless billionaire humiliates a homeless man and his dog in the streets. But when his empire begins to crumble piece by piece, he discovers his enemy isn't just anyone. It's someone with nothing left to lose and a past that will shatter everything. Hector strutted through the bustling city center with an air of superiority that turned heads. His tailored suit gleamed in the afternoon sun, a symbol of his immense wealth and untouchable power. Flanked by two burly security guards, his steps were heavy with arrogance as he navigated the crowded streets, parting the sea of pedestrians like a monarch among commoners. Across the street, Miguel sat on the cracked concrete with Luna, his loyal companion, nestled at his side. Luna, a scruffy brown dog with gentle eyes, wagged her tail softly as Miguel scratched behind her ears. For Miguel, Luna was more than a pet. She was a lifeline, a flicker of warmth in a world that had long turned its back on him. Dressed in layers of tattered clothing, he blended into the background, ignored by passers-by, but not by Hector. As Hector's gaze fell on Miguel, his expression twisted into a sneer. "Look at this trash," he muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. His guards chuckled, their laughter echoing Hector's disdain. Miguel remained still, his face impassive, though his hands tensed around Luna's collar. Hector, emboldened by his audience, stepped closer. His polished shoe nudged a discarded coffee cup near Miguel, sending it spinning across the pavement. "You're polluting my city," Hector spat, the venom in his words cutting through the ambient noise. Luna, sensing the hostility, let out a low growl. Hector's eyes flicked to the dog and his lip curled in disgust. Without warning, he lashed out with his foot, delivering a sharp kick to Luna's side. The yelp that escaped Luna's throat pierced the air, silencing the nearby chatter. She scrambled to her feet, trembling and pressing against Miguel for comfort. A ripple of discomfort spread through the onlookers, but no one intervened. Hector's power loomed too large. Miguel slowly lifted his head, locking eyes with Hector. His face betrayed no emotion, but his gaze carried a weight that made even Hector pause for a fraction of a second. It was not fear or submission, but something deeper, an unspoken promise. "Keep your filthy mud out of my way," Hector snapped before turning on his heel. His guards followed, their laughter resuming as they disappeared into the crowd. Miguel remained still, his hand resting gently on Luna's trembling body. The city seemed to blur around him as memories of another life flickered in the corners of his mind. He had once been a man of strength, someone who commanded respect. But life had stripped him of everything, except Luna. As the sounds of the city reclaimed their dominance, Miguel leaned down to inspect Luna's injury. She whimpered, but allowed him to touch her, her eyes filled with trust despite the pain. Miguel's jaw tightened as he whispered soothing words to her. Around them, the world moved on, oblivious to the storm brewing within Miguel. The attack had been more than an insult. It was a spark igniting a fire he had tried to extinguish long ago. For years, he had endured, surviving the streets with quiet resilience. But Hector's cruelty had crossed a line, awakening a side of him that he thought had been buried forever. As he cradled Luna, Miguel's mind began to turn. Hector had made a grave mistake, one he would come to regret. For Miguel, this was no longer about survival. It was about justice, no matter the cost. Miguel sat in the dim light of an abandoned warehouse, Luna resting on an old blanket beside him. Her injury wasn't severe, but her whimper when she moved sent a pang through his chest. He gently applied a makeshift poultice, whispering soothing words as she licked his hand. The rhythmic sound of her breathing calmed him, but his mind was far from tranquil. The night was quiet, but Miguel's thoughts were loud with echoes of a life he had tried to forget. He stared at his hands, once tools of precision and strength, now calloused and worn. These were the hands that had once gripped championship belts, celebrated by roaring crowds. Miguel Alvarez, the Lion of the Ring. The memory of his glory days was a bittersweet ache. Back then, he had been invincible, a fighter who rose through the ranks with unparalleled speed. His fists had been his livelihood, his weapon, and his escape. But the sport he loved had been tainted by greed and corruption. Miguel had refused to throw a match for the mob, a decision that marked him as a target. What followed was a systematic dismantling of his life. His victories turned into defeats, his allies became traitors, and his career crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal. One night had changed everything. Miguel clenched his fists, the scars on his knuckles a testament to battles fought in and out of the ring. After a brutal setup that left him disgraced and battered, he had vanished from the public eye. The mob's reach was long, and the streets became his refuge. It was there, amidst the cold and hunger, that he had found Luna, a stray, much like himself. From that moment, they had been inseparable. He glanced at Luna now, her soft brown eyes meeting his. "It's just us, kid," he murmured, his voice heavy with a mix of sorrow and resolve. She wagged her tail faintly, as if to reassure him. In her, he had found a reason to keep going, a reminder that not everything in life was cruel. But Hector's attack had reopened old wounds. The man's arrogance and brutality reminded Miguel of the world he had fought so hard to escape, a world where power crushed the weak. The memory of Hector's sneer and Luna's pained cry replayed in his mind, stoking a fire he had long suppressed. Miguel wasn't just angry, he was focused. He hadn't defended himself when Hector struck because he knew that retaliation in that moment would have been meaningless. No, revenge required patience and precision. As the night deepened, Miguel closed his eyes, letting the shadows of his past wash over him. He saw the faces of the men who had betrayed him, heard the jeers of the crowd that once cheered his name, and felt the cold emptiness of the streets that became his home. Each memory was a thread, weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience. He was no longer the man he once was, but he was far from broken. When dawn began to creep through the cracks in the warehouse walls, Miguel opened his eyes. The fire within him burned brighter, tempered by the clarity of purpose. Hector had unleashed something he didn't understand, a predator who had learned to bide his time. Miguel reached out and scratched Luna behind the ears. "They took everything from me once," he said softly, "but not this time." The city outside was waking up, unaware of the storm brewing in its underbelly. Miguel stood, Luna at his side, ready to face whatever came next. The echoes of his past would no longer haunt him. They would guide him. Miguel moved through the city like a shadow, invisible to the throngs of people who ignored his presence. It was an advantage he had grown accustomed to, a cloak of anonymity that allowed him to observe without being seen. Hector's face, twisted in arrogance, remained etched in his mind. Miguel had no doubt that behind the man's wealth and power lay a web of corruption. To dismantle it, he needed more than anger. He needed knowledge. The first step was understanding Hector's world. Miguel began spending his nights trailing the wealthy tycoon, carefully avoiding detection. He noted every building Hector entered, every associate who lingered too long. Hector's routines were meticulously predictable, but it wasn't until Miguel followed him to an unmarked warehouse in the industrial district that things began to click. From a distance, Miguel watched a steady stream of luxury cars pull into the building. Men in tailored suits carried briefcases while burly guards patrolled the perimeter. The transactions were subtle but unmistakable. Illegal arms deals, laundering operations, and even human trafficking. Hector wasn't just an arrogant billionaire. He was a kingpin, feeding off the vulnerabilities of the powerless. Miguel's fist tightened as he crouched in the shadows. He thought of Luna's frightened eyes that day and the countless lives Hector must have ruined. The injustice was a bitter taste in his mouth, but it also sharpened his focus. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about bringing a monster to his knees. To understand the extent of Hector's operations, Miguel needed to dig deeper. He frequented public libraries and internet cafes, using what little money he had to access records and news archives. Hector's empire was vast, hidden behind layers of shell companies and political alliances. Publicly, Hector was a philanthropist, funding community projects and charities. Privately, he controlled a network of exploitation that stretched far beyond the city. Miguel's research uncovered more than he had expected. Hector's dealings were linked to a criminal syndicate notorious for its ruthlessness. The same syndicate that had orchestrated Miguel's downfall years ago. A cold realization settled over him. His pursuit of Hector wasn't just a battle against one man. It was a war against the very organization that had destroyed his life. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Hector wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was a key player. And Miguel now had a target, a man whose empire could be dismantled piece by piece. One night, Miguel followed Hector to an upscale restaurant where the elite gathered. Sitting outside, Miguel observed the interactions through the restaurant's large glass windows. Hector was relaxed, laughing with his companions, exuding the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Miguel couldn't hear the conversation, but he didn't need to. The body language of the men at the table spoke volumes. Hector was at the top, and they were his pawns. As Miguel took mental notes, a plan began to form. He would strike where it hurt most, Hector's reputation. The man thrived on his image, and a single crack in his pristine facade could ripple through his empire. But Miguel couldn't do it alone. To bring Hector down, he needed resources and allies, people willing to expose the truth. For now, Miguel remained patient, his instincts honed from years of survival. He watched, he listened, and he waited. Each day brought him closer to understanding his enemy, and with every discovery, his resolve grew stronger. As the night deepened, Miguel retreated to the warehouse where Luna waited. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing her fur. "We're not just fighting for us," he whispered. "We're fighting for everyone he's hurt." Luna wagged her tail as if she understood. Together, they would take on the monster, one step at a time. The grand ballroom gleamed with opulence, every corner dripping with gold and crystal. Hector's gala was in full swing, a celebration of his latest charitable initiative, a facade designed to mask the darkness of his empire. The city's elite mingled, their laughter ringing hollow against the backdrop of a string quartet playing soft, elegant music. Hector stood at the center of it all, radiating confidence, surrounded by politicians, business tycoons, and the media. Outside, Miguel waited in the shadows, his heartbeat steady despite the enormity of his plan. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, poring over blueprints of the venue and analyzing every detail of Hector's operations. Tonight, he wasn't just a man seeking vengeance. He was a strategist delivering a message. Inside his worn jacket pocket was a flash drive containing damning evidence he had pieced together. Documents, videos, and photos exposing Hector's illicit dealings. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to shatter the man's carefully constructed image. The gala, with its sea of influential attendees and media coverage, was the perfect stage. Miguel slipped through a side entrance, blending in with the waitstaff. He had acquired a uniform earlier that day, and with his natural ability to move unnoticed, no one gave him a second glance. Luna remained outside, hidden in the care of a trusted street vendor who owed Miguel a favor. This wasn't her fight, not yet. The plan was simple. Use the venue's audio-visual system to broadcast the evidence to the entire room. Miguel had already mapped out the control room, knowing it would be lightly guarded. The challenge wasn't getting in. It was ensuring he left without being caught. As Miguel navigated the corridors, he kept his head down, carrying an empty tray to maintain the illusion of purpose. He passed guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, their conversations a mix of shallow pleasantries and veiled competition. The contrast between their world and his fueled his determination. Reaching the control room, Miguel slipped inside and locked the door behind him. The hum of monitors filled the space, the screens displaying live feeds of the ballroom. He plugged the flash drive into the system and began uploading the files. His fingers moved with practiced precision, each keystroke a step closer to unveiling the truth. Back in the ballroom, Hector raised a glass to the room, delivering a speech filled with empty promises and self-congratulations. The crowd clapped politely, unaware of the storm brewing above them. Suddenly, the screens lining the walls flickered, the ambient visuals of charity logos replaced by grainy footage. Gasps rippled through the room as documents scrolled across the displays, wire transfers to offshore accounts, photos of Hector meeting with known criminals, and surveillance videos capturing illicit transactions. The music stopped, and the room descended into chaos. Hector froze, his confident facade cracking as whispers turned to shouts. He barked orders at his security team, but the damage was done. The carefully curated image of the benevolent philanthropist lay in ruins, replaced by the undeniable truth of his corruption. Miguel watched from the control room, a grim satisfaction settling over him. This was only the beginning, a warning shot to rattle Hector and those who supported him. But as he prepared to leave, the sound of footsteps outside the door sent his heart racing. Someone was coming. He slipped out through a maintenance hatch, navigating the building's back corridors with the ease of someone accustomed to evasion. By the time Hector's men burst into the control room, Miguel was gone, melting back into the city's shadows. Outside, he reunited with Luna, who greeted him with a wag of her tail. He knelt beside her, rubbing her head. "It started," he murmured. "He'll know I'm coming now." In the distance, sirens blared as reporters scrambled for answers. Hector might have survived the night's humiliation, but Miguel knew the damage was irreparable. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. The fight had truly begun. The headlines the next morning were explosive. Every major outlet carried variations of the same story. Philanthropist Hector Martinez accused of corruption. While Hector's PR team scrambled to contain the fallout, Miguel sat in a quiet corner of the city's Central Park, flipping through the articles on an old tablet he had picked up at a pawn shop. Luna lay at his feet, her injury healing, but her eyes ever watchful. Miguel knew Hector would retaliate. The man wasn't one to take humiliation lightly. But for now, Miguel had the advantage. His strike had been precise, calculated, and public. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he would need more than his wits and determination to bring Hector's empire crashing down. He needed resources, connections, something he didn't have. That's when she appeared. "Impressive work," said a voice behind him. Miguel tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward Luna's collar as he turned to face the speaker. A woman stood there, her sharp features framed by dark hair pulled into a loose braid. She was dressed simply, but her piercing gaze and the camera slung over her shoulder marked her as someone who saw more than most. "Who are you?" Miguel asked, his voice low, measured. "Gabriela Rivera," she said, stepping closer. "I'm a journalist, and I know you're the one who exposed Hector last night." Miguel's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, his eyes scanning the area for signs of a setup. Gabriela seemed to sense his caution. "Relax," she said, holding up her hands. "I'm not here to turn you in. If anything, I'm here to help." "Help?" Miguel let out a humorless laugh. "Why would a journalist want to help me?" Gabriela's expression hardened. "Because I've been trying to expose men like Hector for years. He's not just a billionaire with a dark side, he's a parasite feeding off the pain of this city. You showed everyone a glimpse of the truth last night, but that's not enough. People forget scandals, especially when men like him have the money to bury them. We need more." "We?" Miguel echoed, his skepticism clear. "Yes, we," Gabriela said firmly. "I've been following Hector's trail for months, but I keep hitting walls. He's got the police in his pocket, and no one with power wants to challenge him. But you've managed to do what no one else has. You've made him vulnerable." Miguel studied her, searching for any sign of deception. She was determined, that much was clear, but trust wasn't something he gave easily. "And what's in it for you?" he asked. Gabriela's eyes softened. "The truth. That's all I care about. People deserve to know who's pulling the strings in their city. And..." She hesitated, then added, "My sister. She was one of the women trafficked through Hector's network. I couldn't save her, but I can make sure he never does it to anyone else." The weight of her words hung in the air. Miguel's instinct was to work alone, to keep his mission as clean and simple as possible. But Gabriela's sincerity was hard to ignore. She had skin in the game, just like he did. "All right," Miguel said finally. "But understand this, I'm not doing this for glory, and I'm not taking unnecessary risks. If you get in the way, I'll walk." Gabriela nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Fair enough. I've already got leads we can use. Financial records, witnesses. With your help, we can turn this into something Hector can't recover from." Miguel didn't respond, but a part of him felt lighter. For the first time since this all began, he wasn't completely alone. As the two of them began discussing their next steps, Luna rested her head on Miguel's lap, her tail thumping softly against the ground. Gabriela reached out cautiously, and Luna sniffed her hand before allowing a gentle pat. "She's a good judge of character," Miguel said, almost as an afterthought. Gabriela smiled. "Then I guess I passed the test." Hector sat in his penthouse office, the sprawling view of the city doing little to soothe his rage. His usually composed demeanor had cracked, and the room bore evidence of his temper. Papers scattered across the floor, a shattered glass staining the expensive rug, and a dent in the edge of his mahogany desk where his fist had landed earlier. The gala disaster had been a humiliation of the highest order. Every headline, every news segment had turned his name into a subject of suspicion and ridicule. Though his lawyers and PR team were working overtime to spin the story, Hector knew the damage was deeper than public perception. Someone had struck at the foundation of his empire, and that someone had to pay. Across the desk, his head of security, Vargas, stood rigid, his expression unreadable, but his stance tense. You're telling me you still don't know who's behind this? Hector demanded, his voice low but venomous. Vargas cleared his throat. We've narrowed it down to a few possibilities, but whoever did this is smart. They didn't leave a trace. It wasn't just a hacker. This was someone with access, someone who knew exactly where to hit. Hector's fingers drummed against the desk as he considered Vargas's words. His mind returned to the image of that grainy footage, those damning documents displayed for all to see. It was personal, a calculated strike meant to destabilize him. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. Find them. I don't care how much it costs. I want them found and I want them dealt with. Vargas nodded. We're already on it. I've got men scouring the city, checking every angle. And what about the evidence? Hector asked. Was it real? Some of it, Vargas admitted. Enough to raise questions, but nothing we can't deny or muddy. The problem is the perception. People don't need proof to believe what they see. Hector's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being on the defensive. Whoever was behind this attack had made a grave mistake. He didn't just crush his enemies, he obliterated them. Double the security, Hector said, his voice cold. I want this building locked down, and I want you to find out who's talking to the press. Someone inside our operation might be helping them. Vargas hesitated for a moment, then said, There's one more thing. A few of our contacts have gone silent, people who've always been reliable. It's like they're cutting ties. Hector's lips curled into a snarl. Fear was spreading through his network, and fear bred disloyalty. If he didn't reestablish control quickly, everything he had built would unravel. Remind them what happens to traitors, he said. As Vargas left to carry out his orders, Hector stared out at the city skyline, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He had clawed his way to the top, crushing anyone who stood in his way. He wouldn't let some anonymous adversary destroy him now. Meanwhile, Miguel and Gabriela worked late into the night, reviewing the files she had collected over months of investigation. Gabriela's tiny apartment had become their makeshift headquarters, cluttered with stacks of documents, photos, and pinned notes on a corkboard. Luna lay curled up on the floor, dozing lightly as the two planned their next move. We need to stay ahead of him, Gabriela said, flipping through a folder of bank records. He'll be hunting for whoever did this. If he finds us. He won't, Miguel interrupted. His voice was calm but firm. He's panicking, and panicked men make mistakes. We'll use that. Gabriela nodded, though her brow furrowed with concern. What about you? He'll dig into anyone who might have been at the gala. I covered my tracks, Miguel replied, his tone unshakable. Right now, we need to focus on his next move. He's going to lash out. We have to be ready. As if on cue, Gabriela's phone buzzed. She picked it up, her expression shifting as she read the message. It's from one of my sources, she said. Hector's men are out in force, looking for someone. I think they know you were involved. Miguel's eyes darkened. Then it's time to disappear again. Before they could act, a sharp knock at the door froze them in place. Miguel instinctively moved to shield Gabriela, his body tensing as Luna let out a low growl. The knock came again, louder this time. Gabriela reached for the handle, her hand trembling slightly. Miguel nodded at her, his gaze fixed on the door. Careful, he whispered. When the door swung open, a man in a suit stood on the threshold, flanked by two others. His expression was calm, but his eyes glinted with menace. Mr. Alvarez, the man said, his tone eerily polite. You've caused quite a stir. My employer would like to have a word. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Miguel sat across from Gabriela at her small kitchen table, his mind racing as they processed the man's words. The visit had been a warning. Hector's reach was closer than they'd realized. But the man had left without incident, his message delivered. Hector knew who they were. Gabriela broke the silence. We can't stay here. He'll come back. Miguel nodded. We need to move, but not without finishing this. He gestured to the papers scattered across the table. Among them were records Gabriela had dug up, a labyrinth of transactions linking Hector to various crimes. But one file stood out, its contents chilling. This changes everything, Miguel said, holding it up. The file detailed Hector's connection to La Sombra, a notorious criminal syndicate. Miguel's heart pounded as he read the names listed, names he recognized from his past. The very organization that had orchestrated his downfall was not only tied to Hector, but had likely positioned him as their puppet. Gabriella leaned over, her eyes scanning the document. "This is bigger than we thought," she murmured. "If Hector's working with them, taking him down could expose the whole network." Miguel clenched his fists, memories flooding back. The faces of those who had betrayed him, the fight that had ended his career, it all led back to La Sombra. "This isn't just about Hector anymore," he said, his voice low. "It's personal." Gabriella nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then we make it count. We hit them where it hurts." Miguel's jaw tightened. For years, he had run from his past. Now he realized it had been leading him here all along. The night air was sharp as Miguel and Gabriella moved through the city's industrial district, slipping between shadows cast by towering warehouses. Miguel carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, its contents carefully chosen for the mission ahead. Gabriella followed closely, her camera bag bouncing against her side. Luna trotted silently at Miguel's heels, her senses attuned to the tension in the air. They reached a derelict building on the edge of the district, a safe house Miguel had used during his years on the streets. Inside, the space was bare but functional. A battered table, a few chairs, and a cot in the corner. Miguel set the bag on the table and began unpacking its contents: blueprints of Hector's mansion, a set of tools, and a small stash of cash. Gabriella spread out her notes, her voice steady despite the weight of their task. "The mansion's security is tight, but we've got an opening. Hector's hosting a private meeting tomorrow night with members of La Sombra. Most of the guards will be focused on keeping the meeting secure, leaving the rest of the property vulnerable." Miguel studied the blueprints, his finger tracing the perimeter of the estate. "We'll use the east entrance. It's less guarded and leads directly to the basement where they're holding Luna's tracker and evidence Gabriella needs to secure her sister's case." Gabriella hesitated, then asked, "What happens if we get caught?" Miguel met her gaze, his expression hard. "We won't. But if something goes wrong, you focus on getting the evidence out, no matter what happens to me." Gabriella opened her mouth to protest, but Miguel raised a hand. "This is the only way. Hector's tied to La Sombra. If we can't stop him now, they'll keep expanding their reach." The gravity of his words settled between them. Gabriella nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but we're both getting out of there, alive." Miguel smirked faintly, appreciating her resolve. "Let's make sure of it then." They spent the rest of the night finalizing the plan, every detail scrutinized. As dawn approached, Miguel leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping in. Luna rested her head on his lap, and he absently scratched behind her ears. "This isn't just a fight," Miguel murmured to himself. "It's justice." Gabriella, overhearing, added softly, "And it's hope, for everyone he's hurt." The moon hung low over Hector's sprawling mansion, casting silvery shadows across the estate. Miguel crouched behind a cluster of bushes near the eastern gate, his breath steady despite the tension coiled in his chest. Gabriella knelt beside him, her camera slung across her back and a small recorder clipped to her belt. Luna stayed close, her eyes sharp and alert. The plan was simple but dangerous. Gabriella would slip inside through the service entrance, retrieve the documents from Hector's private office, and upload the damning files to a secure server. Meanwhile, Miguel would create a distraction, drawing the guards away to give her the time she needed. It was a high-stakes gamble, but one they couldn't afford to lose. Miguel glanced at Gabriella. "Stick to the shadows. If anything goes wrong, you run." Gabriella nodded, her expression resolute. "Same goes for you." Miguel didn't reply. He gave Luna a reassuring pat before slipping into the shadows, moving with the practiced silence of a predator. He reached the perimeter of the estate, disabling a security camera with a quick cut of its wires. The guards patrolled methodically, but Miguel anticipated their movements, slipping past them like a ghost. Inside, Gabriella moved with equal precision. The mansion's halls were gilded with Hector's opulence, but beneath the grandeur lay the stench of his corruption. She found the office quickly, her heart pounding as she searched for the files. The safe was hidden behind a painting, just as the blueprints had suggested. With trembling hands, she input the code Miguel had uncovered. Outside, Miguel initiated his distraction. A flashbang exploded near the western wing, sending guards scattering in confusion. He moved swiftly, using the chaos to disable more cameras and draw attention away from Gabriella's location. The mansion was alive with shouts and the thundering footsteps of armed men. Gabriella retrieved the files and transferred them to her device. Her heart leapt as the progress bar reached 100%. She pocketed the drive and whispered into her earpiece, I've got it. Heading out. Miguel's voice came back, steady but urgent. Move fast. They're regrouping. As Gabriela navigated back through the mansion, she heard a commotion near the eastern gate. Miguel had been cornered. She hesitated, her instincts screaming to help, but she knew the mission's success depended on her escape. Miguel faced Hector's men with calm defiance, his fists raised. The guards hesitated, wary of his stance, a fighter's stance, honed by years of experience. Miguel struck first, his movements fluid and powerful. He dispatched 2 guards quickly, but more poured in, overwhelming him with sheer numbers. Hector appeared, his face twisted in fury. "You think you can take me down?" he roared. "You're nothing." Miguel, bloodied but unbroken, grinned. "We'll see about that." As Hector advanced, Gabriela burst through the service door into the night, Luna running at her side. They raced toward the safe house, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Miguel was still inside. But she carried the evidence, their weapon against Hector. A deafening explosion shattered the night. Gabriela turned, horror etched on her face as flames erupted from the mansion's western wing. She knew Miguel had set the final distraction in motion. Tears blurred her vision as she kept running, the sound of sirens growing in the distance. The sun rose over the city, casting a golden light on streets, still whispering with the news of the previous night's events. The explosion at Hector's mansion had dominated the headlines, accompanied by leaked files exposing his ties to La Sombra. The evidence Gabriela and Miguel had gathered was undeniable, forcing authorities to act. Hector's name, once synonymous with power and prestige, now evoked shame and outrage. Gabriela sat in a small cafe near the outskirts of the city, her laptop open on the table. She scrolled through the news reports, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and sorrow. Luna lay curled at her feet, her ears flicking at every sound. A quiet presence behind her made her turn sharply. Miguel stood there, a faint smile on his bruised face. His clothes were torn and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm, but he was alive. Gabriela's breath hitched as she stood, her relief spilling over. "You made it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Miguel nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I told you, I'm not done yet." They sat together, the tension of the past few days giving way to a rare moment of calm. Miguel reached down to scratch Luna behind the ears, her tail wagging softly in response. "The files worked," Gabriela said. "Hector's been arrested, and with the media storm, there's no way La Sombra can cover their tracks. Authorities are already raiding their operations." Miguel leaned back, his gaze distant. "It's a start, but they're bigger than Hector. Cutting off one head doesn't kill the beast." Gabriela frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't over," Miguel replied. "Not for me. La Sombra destroyed my life. They've ruined countless others. I can't stop now, not when I know I can make a difference." Gabriela studied him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Then you won't do it alone. I've seen what they're capable of, and I've seen what we can do together." A small smile tugged at Miguel's lips. "You're stubborn." "Someone has to be," Gabriela shot back, her tone light but resolute. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey binding them together. Miguel glanced at the horizon, his mind already moving forward. He had started this mission for justice, but now he saw the potential for something greater, a chance to dismantle the systems that preyed on the vulnerable. Luna shifted, resting her head on Miguel's lap. He stroked her fur, finding solace in her unwavering loyalty. "We've got work to do," he said softly. Gabriela nodded. "Then let's get started." As they left the cafe, the city buzzed with the promise of change. Hector's downfall had shaken the foundations of power, and while the fight ahead would be long, Miguel and Gabriela were ready. Together, they would face the shadows, turning the pain of their pasts into a beacon of hope. In the distance, unseen and unspoken, the remnants of La Sombra stirred. A new battle loomed, but Miguel no longer felt alone. He walked into the light with Luna and Gabriela at his side, prepared for whatever came next. Sometimes, life pushes people to their breaking point, and it's in those moments that their true strength emerges. This story reminds us that even the seemingly powerless can challenge the mightiest forces when driven by justice and resilience. But what would you have done if you were in Miguel's shoes? Would you have walked away from the fight, or risked everything to stand up for what's right? Click on the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and dive deeper into stories that challenge your perspective. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales that inspire, entertain, and make you question what you're truly capable of. See you in the next one.